Only way you can grow your company is to continue to be better than you were yesterday. And I say this to my entire team. Holidays are coming. I say, my one wish is that we all get better. The version of us in 2026 has to be better version than 2025.
I'm Felicia Shakiba, and this is CPO Playbook, where we solve a business challenge in every episode. Welcome to CPO Playbook. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Shalabh Gupta, founder and CEO at Unisysive Therapeutics. Thank you so much for joining us,
Thank you.
Dr. Gupta.
Thank you so much for having me.
And you're here in the Bay Area, is that right?
Absolutely.
I'm really excited to chat with you today because we are talking about biotech, which is one of the hardest industries to build in. It's expensive, it's regulated, slow, and very unforgiving. And most founders need massive teams, deep-pocketed VCs, and years of burn before they see a breakthrough. However, you've built this company the opposite way, actually, in a way I've never heard before. You are a physician turned Wall Street analyst who raised $130 million without taking Silicon Valley money and took your company public with just 22 employees, now on the brink of FDA approval. So I'd love to learn from you. How did you do this, and what every leader can learn about scaling with this discipline and purpose and conviction? So how did you get started?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. And just want to clarify two parts. Number one, we've raised over $150 million. This is all in public market. So we had raised some before. That's number one, just so the facts are correct. And number two is that I took the company public with one employee, which was me. And today, at the moment, as of, we are in end of 2025, we have 22 employees or so. So those are just the two facts. Just want to clarify.
Wow. Even more impressive.
Thank you. I went about building the company was instead of focusing on just discovering new molecules or discovering new drugs, I felt they were drugs that were already built beyond discovery. They were built into clinical development. And I felt there was an opportunity to take these drugs or these molecules that were sitting in somewhere else and be able to advance them to a place where we can create value. It helps a lot of stakeholders, but to give you a perspective that I really, very, very strongly believe, it helps the original inventor, because if they discover something and they advance it from point A to point B, but they're not advancing further because of a resource constraint, because of strategic priorities, we can then advance it. It helps patients, it helps physicians, it helps our investors. Because in a risk continuum, typically, as you know, the drugs go through discovery, then they go into animal testing, then they go to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Instead of starting every story from discovery, I felt they were assets, they were drug candidates that were sitting somewhere else. And if I could bring them in, build a company around it, which I will call a purpose-driven organization, focus on one therapeutic area, one set of problems to solve, then we can make everybody's life better. It obviously gives you a little bit of head start because you're not spending first 5, 6, 7 years into discovery and then giving in, hoping that you get a molecule. It is not the only way to build a biotech. It is something that I believed in with my background, my expertise. This was something that I could do it. And that's how I started.
Wow. And I want to just, for the listeners who are maybe not familiar as deep as you are with biotech, how would you summarize what you do or what the business does for those who are outside the industry? Yeah.
Right. So one way, big picture way to think about it is that we are not different than many other industries in some ways, but we are different compared to other industries in other ways. So where there are similarities, I'll point out that first and then talk about things that are slightly unique to biotech. One thing that doesn't change, as you know, Felicia, that in order to build a business, you need to have a problem. I always believe that it is better to have a problem identified clearly than focus on solutions. There are companies that are built where people have solutions and they look for a problem. So the problem statement for us was patients who suffer from kidney diseases, in particular, patients who suffer from kidney diseases but have high phosphate. More so because it's a big problem. There are 550,000 patients on dialysis, 80% of them, that is roughly 450,000 patients, who still struggle with phosphate lowerings uh, day to day. And we have 6 approved drugs on the market, but 75% of patients do not achieve their target serum phosphate level. And lastly, to define the problem, this is a big enough market opportunity in the sense, truly commercially speaking, sales of this class of drug or the patients who suffer from hyperphosphatemia and the medications in the market sold for roughly over $1.5 billion last year in the US alone. So to summarize what I said, I focused on the problem. I focused on a problem that was unmet. I realized that there are 6 approved drugs. I also found that there's 6 approved drugs, yet 75% patients have not been able to achieve the target serum phosphate level. And it is a big enough commercial opportunity. Then comes out that do I have a solution that can solve that problem?
I love the way that you approached that because it really does, start with the problem. And so many leaders and founders get into the trap of falling in love with their product or falling in love with the solution only to later find out that that solution is not the best solution to the problem. So I think that's a really important point that you made. Kind of going back to understanding you and yourself and your the context of who you are and what you've learned in your career. When you were at the very beginning, when did you realize that practicing medicine wasn't enough? Or maybe just enough, but not enough to build a public company?
I think from very beginning of my career or very early on, I wanted to focus on 2 things. My dad is a physician, and many of us get influenced by our families and role models. He still continues to see patients pro bono, just helping people out there. So being a physician came naturally to me. That was one part, which also relates to being able to help people. And the other part was intuitively, intellectually, I was very, very drawn to biological sciences. So these 2 things combined together got me into medicine, go through residency training. Second year of my training at NYU Hospital, NYU Medical Center, I started to feel a disconnect because what I was doing in a day-to-day practice was not making my patients happy. And I've talked about this very openly, that single metric that seemed to matter at the time was in my practice, in my particular specialty, was length of stay, called LOS. So I felt that the entire care was driven not about what do we do for patients and how satisfied they are, or in fact, we are doing the right thing clinically for them. It was that how quickly you can send patients home. And that just seemed very much not what I had expected. And there were other components to it, but to keep part simple, I love practicing medicine. I loved my time interacting with patients. I did feel in my heart and my soul that I was making their life better. But what I was feeling fulfilled by was a very small component of my day to day medical practice. I felt 80% of my time was spent in doing things that were not related to what we were doing to make patients' life better. That 80% related to paperwork, making sure insurance companies approve it. And that didn't change as I continued with my medical practice. So I decided to branch out and not quit medicine because I don't like interactions, but more so find more deeper meaning. And that to me was about bringing new products to market. And today, what I do as a company, we still are very much related to patients because I practiced medicine for 10 years, a few years in training, few years as a practicing physician, I can relate to physicians. And in order to build something, especially an organization which is focused on creating value for investors, I also believe that investors have to be taken into account because it has to work for investors, it has to work for physicians, it has to work for patients. So these are 3 key stakeholders. There are obviously more broader ways to define it, or insurance companies, healthcare plans also play a role there. But if you think about these 3 key stakeholders, that hasn't changed, whether I practice as a physician, or I went to Wall Street, or I do what I do today.
And that is a pretty huge jump from medicine to Wall Street. There's very few people who have made that jump. What did that experience teach you about how biotech companies really work, and how did it change the way you think about impact?
So I had two roles in two different investment banks as an analyst. So I covered biotech companies like mine that are publicly traded, or they go to public market as a part of IPO, or some of these companies were trading in other exchanges outside United States, like Toronto Stock Exchange in Tel Aviv, Israeli Stock Exchange, or in Europe, and they come into US market. Common thing I found by talking to biotech companies, not always, but many of the biotech companies at the time when I worked as an analyst, they had this impression that they have a product and some big pharma company will just buy them. So, which is fine, which is a way to build a company. But then another component of my career was to work for UBS, where I covered pharma companies. So I got to know companies like Pfizer, because we cover six of the largest pharma companies like Pfizer, Merck, Wyeth, Schering-Plough, Bristol-Myers Squibb, Eli Lilly. In talking to pharma companies, you realize that Pfizer or companies like Pfizer cannot buy 100 companies a year. They only buy 5 companies a year, and they have to be of certain size. So this is one example about how different market segments think about their product versus what the reality is, if you will, of the marketplace. And then I also understood how a small biotech company gets valued versus how a big pharma gets valued. Understanding these dynamics as an analyst helped me to understand where are the gaps, if you will. And just to point out one specific point, big pharmaceutical companies are really good in doing many things, but they also rely on a smaller organizations for innovative products. And if somehow innovative products can come and scale up, that fits into the strategic vision of the big pharma companies, there is a win-win for everybody. It is not something that I was the only one to figure this out, but seeing it time and time played over and over again. Also understanding that you cannot build a company hoping and praying that big pharma company will come and acquire you. That is not a business plan. It was just very clear. And lastly, as a physician, I understood many components of healthcare, but understanding how one data release moves the stock price up or down, how investors think about it, also knowing that it is not just that investors are just only looking at the company presentation, but how peer-reviewed publication, for example, a new article in New England Journal of Medicine, how that can move the stock price. That was something very, very, I got to see from inside, if you will.
You had a front row seat, basically.
Correct.
We'll be right back. Back to the show. Yeah. And then you moved into biotech with Genentech. What did you witness there, especially under an inspiring CEO that maybe had planted the first seed of, one day I'm going to build something of my own?
My original career plan was to work at Genentech, or an organization like Genentech, for at least 5 to 10 years. And I moved to Bay Area. I started working at Genentech. Genentech at the time was led by Art Levinson, who was in the process of leaving the company. And as you pointed out, and as I've talked about this before, the impression I got by talking to many people at Genentech, especially Art was about to leave, and then he left sometime after I joined, that people felt personal connection to the CEO. Even though Genentech, when I joined, it was a larger organization with around 10,000 people or more, and then it got acquired by Roche, became even bigger. What I felt that it was two or three things that I can summarize. One is that there was a purpose-driven organization. Number two, the CEO led the company and inspired the company in a way that very few people that I had encountered until then could do. And I think that hasn't changed even today. I still think that was a very, very powerful leadership role. And three is that if people are driven by a purpose, amazing things can be done, because then they are working together to solve a problem. And the reason I say this to you, because Genentech was in the business of developing new drugs, but people who worked 4 or 5 levels below Art Levinson, they all felt that Art spoke to them personally. And this is a 10,000 plus people organization. This was something which is very unique and it inspires you. And every day that I drove my car to Genentech campus to work there, I kept asking myself, maybe there is something I could do, not no comparison to Genentech, but maybe it's something I could build which is purpose driven that may help me fulfill what I want to do and build a product, build something that will help patients' life. And that sort of a true guiding north, if you will, that is how I thought about it. And that inspired me to change my career and not work at Genentech for a very long period of time, but actually move on to build companies from there.
Yeah, and you've built 3 companies, but this one you started alone, right? 1 employee, no assets, no upfront capital. What was the moment that you decided, "I'm gonna build this my way," after these 3 companies? Like,
So there are two or three components to it. I want to just say one thing just to provide some humility to this conversation. I was a first employee or the only employee, but there were a number of people who have given me support throughout my career. It would be a fallacy to say I did it all by myself. I think it would be important to call out number of mentors, and you started the conversation saying that I live in the Bay Area. There are numerous people who played a role throughout my journey, and I would encourage every entrepreneur not to just seek one mentor, but to meet people within your industry, outside your industry, to ask help, listen to them, ask them questions, and try to reflect on their answer. So I built this company alone because I felt there was a late stage program, which I said I was able to acquire a drug that somebody else had spent $25 million over 10 years in development. I wasn't starting from scratch. I started from scratch in the sense there was no asset, but I was able to acquire the asset based on my prior track record and the belief that I could take this company into public market. That's number one. Number two, as I would say to you again, that there were people who were involved. They were not an employee role, but I was very clear that I wanted to hire people as a consultant if I could. I didn't want to hire employee till we had the money. And number three, I had identified people whom would we hire once we had the money. It's about the idea that if an investor were to ask you, well, how would you, if I gave you the money, how will you build it? It wasn't no such thing. First, you give me the money, then I'll tell you how I do it. The business plan was written very clear what we will do, what we'll do for 6 months, for 12 years, 12 months. And here are the list of people who will be part of this team. Initially building is small and remaining very committed that we will not hire. I didn't want to build a company that will be measured. The success measure is only the number of employees I have, but based on what can we deliver. So those are the thought process. And I think I explained to you earlier that I understood that if I took the company public, how public markets will value the company and how public markets will react if we generate the right set of data in terms of stock appreciation and so on and so forth.
I think that's a really important point because we hear a lot of stories about founders and how they started and perhaps their co-founders and how they built, from the ground up. But very few people talk about the network that they're a part of that actually contribute, right? What did you get from your network? What were some of those critical pieces of either knowledge or support or information that you felt more confident about and saying that this network that I have is very valuable?
Yeah. So I know it's a very important part, and thanks for zoning in that. I think one learns from one's own mistakes. It would be a fallacy to tell you that I never made mistakes. In fact, I made mistakes that I wish I didn't make. The only thing you can do from those mistakes is to reflect on and say, how can I avoid that in the future? That's number one. Number two, you learn from people you respect. And these are not the people we are talking about, those who have never built a company, but I went and asked for help with number of CEOs, not just in healthcare, but also tech companies. Because we think biotech people especially think that they are unique, and that is a fallacy. They are unique in some ways because biotech companies require a lot of money, but there are certain things that are common phenomenon. Doesn't matter what you're building, focusing on a problem, finding a solution, scaling your organization, being resource constrained, yet be resourceful. These things are common for any business. So learning from my other mentors in the industry, outside industry, also asking them What would you see? What will make this company financeable? Then coming back to this idea, what is the next most important thing that I can do? I always talk about focusing on 3 priorities or 5 at the most, but no more than 5. And you say, well, Shalabh, that's really not practically possible because the list for, even for me today, my list is long. I didn't say that to-do list. I said priorities that you can do because no one can work on 100 priorities at any given time. The problem in building a company is that if you don't realize the list is a very long list, raise money, build product, hire people, also file taxes, also make sure your books are up to date, one can get overwhelmed. It takes wisdom to realize that all of that are there to-do lists. But today, the most important thing I can do is probably focus on building my product, refining my business plan, and raising money, right? The reason to say that focusing on a few key priorities is the only way one can solve an endless list of problems to solve. That takes a wisdom. And you may not be that wise yourself, but no one says don't ask for help. And when you ask for help, you will get varied response. You don't have to take all of them as on their face value. But then going back to this idea of reflection, you reflect from your own mistakes and your successes. You reflect on what people advise you, their viewpoint, and then come up with your own business plan that helps you execute. We are all different. I came with a very different background. I'm not a chemist. I'm not somebody who had taken a drug in preclinical development and have 5 drugs approved. So I very quickly found out that I need to build myself, my team around places where I don't have that deep domain expertise. I have a medical background, so clinical point of view, running clinical trials, I don't need that much help, or I have at least some information. I understand fundraising, so I didn't need that much help there. So it's again looking at your strength as well as your weaknesses and making sure, I call those blind spots. You cannot have too many blind spots. Few blind spots we all have, but some areas of expertise, you need to have your help very quickly early on. And lastly, coming back to this idea of building this, one thing I realize in our industry, especially in biotech, Food and Drug Administration, the FDA has a lot of role to play very early on after acquiring the drug from a previous company with a very small team, few consultant, and went to FDA and requested FDA's guidance in changing the regulatory pathway. Instead of a traditional phase 1, 2, and 3 pathway, which is a called 505B1 pathway, I went and aligned with FDA to allow us to give us a shorter pathway, which is called 505B2 pathway. Without that, we would have never been successful. And a lot of times, and I will say this one more time to clarify, a lot of times and a lot of people believe because they asked X person, Y person, or Z person, they understand what would FDA say. I think it's good to have an input from people, consultant, or people who have been doing that. But I always say the only way to know what FDA thinks is to go and talk to FDA. You cannot go unprepared, but I wanted to get FDA's input directly. So that was one small thing that I can say that was wise thing to do. It wasn't because I was so wise, because I had made mistakes in the past. I learned from them. I realized that it's one thing I could do is to very quickly understand what is FDA's viewpoint in terms of our development path. And that helped us to then be able to raise money, grow the company. But this is an example of not my wisdom. I'm sure, of course, you could give me credit and I could take all the credit. It was those people who were around me. It was those conversations that took years to build those relationships, but those conversations that helped me to have a clinical program, a very clear regulatory pathway. Because, Felicia, let me say why that help matters, because that helps you to define how quickly you can get your drug on the market. Because we had a clarity from FDA, not from my consultant, not from the person who had developed 10 different drugs. They're all useful, but actually talking to the actual stakeholder is the key. And then talking to physicians. I'm not a nephrologist. I'm a physician, all right, but I'm not a nephrologist. I went and met hundreds of nephrologists. In fact, my series of angel investors were nephrologists. And you will say, well, if you're a nephrologist, how can you meet hundreds of nephrologists? I always say the journey of 1,000 steps start with the first step, and then the next step, and the next one, and the next one. And that's how I did. So I started talking to some nephrologists. Some of them saw the product profile and they shut up. It will definitely be successful. I can tell you that I will put my patients on it. If you have a product like this, we will put our dialysis patients on it. And this again, I want to just connect back the dot. How do you know customer validation? Go and talk to your customers. My customers are not
Right.
just physicians, because ultimately you say, well, they are patients, and my physicians can't even buy the product because it's not FDA approved. But they believe so much on it, Felicia, because they gave us funding and they gave me input about how to think about commercializing the drug. And that is how I became more knowledgeable. And it's an iterative process. And even today, we are in 2025, 7 years after acquiring the product. I go to every medical conference that I can get my hands on and talk to physicians. Today, despite the fact we have a lot bigger organization, I have a commercial team, because I want to hear their concern. If you don't talk to your physicians, who are the final people who are prescribing your drug, if you don't talk to the nurses, if you don't talk to a dietitian, you wouldn't know what are the barriers for them to be able to prescribe your drug.
What you had just explained about going to FDA, there's something there that clicked for me, which was in a biotech creating a drug, your customer essentially is the end user, right? The patient taking the drug. But there is a major
Yeah,
stakeholder, which is the FDA. They essentially, stakeholder slash customer, right? Because you
yeah,
have to get through the FDA to get your customer.
yeah,
So it makes complete sense that you went in so early. It's basically parallel to building your product with your customer,
correct.
right? In order to understand what that alignment between product market fit. And you did that. That's exactly what you did. It's just a different way of doing it in your industry,
Yes,
right? But
yes.
that's essentially what you did. And it's no wonder that you've gotten so far so fast because of that particular like decision that you made.
Absolutely. I think of FDA as a partner, and they obviously have a authority to approve your drug, but they also can help you to think about how to get to that finish line. You asked me about my career very early on in 2003 or 4 timeframe. I've worked with a company that became very successful company, not because of my contribution, but I played a very small role in their overall development path. Were able to grow because I went to the FDA way back roughly 20 years ago. And my impression of FDA was that there are some very, very smart people. If you could relate to them, because ultimately they are human beings, their job is to approve the drug. And maybe you think about your vantage point and they are thinking about slightly different vantage point, but aligning with them, understanding their concerns, and thinking of them as your ally, as partner, it's the one way you can help yourself. And that did not change then. We have had our own challenges. We were asked to rerun a trial, or not rerun, excuse me, run an additional trial. We are in the process of resubmitting our application. But no matter what the situation is, we always think about FDA as a partner, as an ally, because that's the way we can get our drug on the market.
Right. And it's interesting because that was like a really big first step, but you also needed money. I'm sure you raised, what did you say, 150 million? Is that right?
More, yeah, more than that, but yeah, more than that.
Even more than
Yeah.
that, but yeah. So in storytelling, credibility, the discipline that you need to raise that kind of capital as a founder, how do you do that?
I
I
think,
mean,
yeah,
obviously you have the background and all of that, but how do you do the actual, showing up in the process of that raising that capital? What are the things that matter to raise that?
yeah, I think absolutely. I think I can quantify that into some few bullet points, if you will. Number one is that for investors, what matters is that the problem, what solution you have, why you will succeed where others may not succeed. In biotech, it is very important to talk about the moat. In any business, it's a moat. What will prevent somebody else to come after you and copy your idea product? for biotech, for companies like us, is a patent. We have a very diverse and broad patent portfolio. Without that, we couldn't have done it. And from very early on, like, so these are the key factors, right? But that's just not enough, right? Then as you go, those are the basic table stakes to get you to meet with an investor. Then it comes down to the idea that you have to be able to, if they ask you a question about potential risk, you have to be honest with them. You have to lay out the risks that you have, and you tell them how are you thinking about addressing those risks. Risk can be a clinical trial. Risk could be your amount of money and time you think it may not be enough for running clinical trial. I think in my experience, dedicated healthcare investors, biotech investors understand risk. They don't, you don't have to skirt the discussion around risk. They want to hear how will you address that risk. They want to understand your thinking. So being very clear about how you plan to address risk. Number two, Felicia, look, I'm grateful to all those investors who funded us, but it's also a bi-directional trust building process. We are a public
Mm-hmm.
company. My investors have to believe in what we do, and not just today, but also in the past when we have had challenges. You have to be honest with them and tell them this is a problem you encountered, you didn't anticipate it, but this is how you can solve it. So being able to build trust, it takes time. No one can build trust over course of one or two meetings. So understanding there is a trust part, and also understanding there is a process. As a public company, I talk to a number of investors. We don't know who is buying our shares on a daily basis. Absolutely don't know. But those conversations then lead to longer term relationship. Over time, if you were to raise money, maybe one of those investors that you talk to, they become your anchor investors. And that's how we got this far. There are conversations we have had that you just do your very best, answer your questions, and you don't hear back from them, really, sometime for next 6 months. So every conversation you have, it is not a transactional conversation. People think about that, oh, I go pitch so and so. Pitching is fine, but building relationship with somebody takes time. I've become more focused in the last part where I have gone and talked to the other investors. For sake of my fellow entrepreneurs, I said, can you give an example where a company, a CEO came to you in 2023 and you didn't invest? And then they came to you in 2024, you didn't invest. And then they came to you in 2025, you did invest. Reason I'm mentioning this, Felicia, in my case, that has those, this is how company progress. But people feel that if they don't hear back from an investor, they feel disappointed or they feel disheartened. But you have to understand, it's not just a question about what you're pitching. Every fund has its own focus. They have their own investment
Right.
mandate. And sometimes it's not that what you're pitching is the wrong thing or your idea is bad, but you need to de-risk the idea further. You need to advance your product hypothesis further. Therefore, if you are so lucky that you could get a feedback, you always want to take a feedback. And every feedback is a feedback. It gives a direction. It's an iterative process. You should never feel, even today, sometimes people say, no, we are not interested. And you just have to take it and just move on without taking it personally. And number two, you have to be grateful for the fact that they gave you time. I mean, really, sincerely, like you have to have that level of humility that if you're talking to investor, it's not always about you talk to them once and therefore they're going to write you a check. I think that is sometimes people miss it. It's not only what happens after that meeting, it's also your personal behavior in following through on the conversation, responding to the question they have asked, and remaining open to their criticism. Hard thing to say to people, but we all get criticized. You think I have raised money, therefore I'd never been given negative feedback? 100% of time, I just say, no, thank you for telling me. If I can do something about it, I say, I'll try to do this better. If I can't do about something, I say, thank you. I assure you that means a lot to me. We'll try to do better next time because that helps you to become better. Only way you can grow your company is to continue to be better than you were yesterday. And I say this to my entire team. holidays are coming. I say, my one wish is that we all get better. The version of us in 2026 has to be better version than 2025.
We'll be right back. Back to the show. I want to say two things because I think not enough people talk about this. We all know what feedback is, but it comes in so many different scales.
Yes.
There's harsh feedback, there's light feedback, there's lack of feedback, there's too much feedback. It's all shows up very differently, but I always have liked to say that feedback is like a gift. It's a golden nugget, if you will. Whether it's wrong or right or whatnot, if it's wrong feedback and you don't align with it, I think that part of being able to be thankful for it and then reflect and make your own decision and say, maybe that's not for me, or maybe I do need to really think about that. That allows you to practice having information that's maybe ambiguous to you, but helps you make better decisions. Because what makes you make great decisions? It's dealing with ambiguity. It's trying to make sense of what you don't understand and being able to take the right path, right? So I 100% agree with you. And I think that that is a really big part in why investors believe in you is because you probably do take their feedback. Maybe you've pushed back or maybe not, but at the end of the day, they're seeing how you can be adaptive and how you make those decisions. And that in itself is a way for an investor, I feel, that allows them to think about whether or not you're a founder to invest in. But on top of that, I have one more question for you because I recently spoke to a founder and he is a fantastic just technologist. And he's built tons of startups. He's helped other startups build startups. And he is we were in this conversation and he said, well, I said, why haven't you gone to, raise money you can build anything. Like, why haven't you gone to seek investment? He says, well, I've only got one shot. I've only got a silver bullet and I have to make it perfect. Before I go. Would you recommend that that founders wait and take that silver bullet, when they have it, or is there an alternative path here?
Right. I think I would describe it as that there is something in between. Let me provide more context. I wouldn't suggest to wait for a silver bullet because no matter when you think you're ready, you're never ready. And no matter whatever version, we refine our corporate presentation even today. We've been public company for 4 years, private to like you do, because there is always one more thing you can do to make it better. And if you wait for one more thing, you are never ready. That's number one. Number two, there is some wisdom in what he said. You don't want to go not being ready. In other words, you do not want to go being sloppy or you have typos in your deck. Just small things. You don't understand how far your patterns extend. Somebody asks you a question and you say, I'll get back to you, but you don't have information ready and you can't get back to them for 3 weeks. That is not good either. The interim pathway is as following. One that I use it is that I have a select group of investors whom I consider friends. And I said, please, even with them, I went with the respect and I said, I'm not looking for your money. All I wanted to is to get your feedback. And I would pitch them as I would pitch a normal investor whom I don't know. But their feedback was very constructive in the sense they provided that maybe this information comes before, maybe you need to be ready with this information, maybe you need to do market research. And that allowed me to, for lack of a better word, softly start to make few things better. And that allowed then to go with the investors, start talking to them. I don't want to be unprepared. I don't want to wait for perfection. I don't want to go sloppily, but I also feel there is a point in time that you say, this is the feedback, this is the place where I am. And at that point, you start to talk to some few people. You don't want to go and talk to the broad market and talk to all of your 100 potential investors. But is it possible that, especially if you've lived long enough and have a group of investors that you trust, could you ask some of them to give you honest feedback? Answer is yes. Because I do believe it's an iterative process. No matter what you are, if you waited for 2 more years, let's just say, and you forgot one important component of it, the only way to know whether you are heading in the right direction or not is to get feedback. but that does not have to be formal feedback. You could get informal feedback. And that goes back to the context of having a broad set of network, your advisors. I don't go to investors. I want to go to another CEO. Some of the component in my presentation came from another CEO who had faced a similar set of challenges in terms of their product profile. And they say, Shalabh, this is how we do it. I said, really? You put this out there? He said, no, we don't even wait for investor to ask this question. This is on a slide number ABC, comes right before our appendix. That helped me to put that in our corporate deck. So you get information from many different places. Investors are not the only place, but if you were to wait, you don't want to wait forever. I definitely I don't disagree with that part. There is a silver bullet, but I don't think it's a one silver bullet. I think you have a series of bullets. Use them judiciously. There is no denying, I think, what he was alluding to, and maybe there is another way. You do not want to go unprepared. There are 6, 7 different key components. What's your competitive differentiation? Why you would succeed, others haven't succeeded. What is your, I mentioned about IP. Who are your team members? Who are your scientific advisory board members? Whom else have you talked? Do you have any primary market research? These things are universal. No matter what you're developing, people will ask you. You may not have done a 500 physician market research, but you may have done a smaller market research, but some component of that, you have to have it.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Gupta, I love where this conversation went. And I think it's one of the reasons why I love the show is because it always ends up something that I didn't anticipate. So it was a true pleasure in understanding how you got to where you are and learning about your business and your story. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. And for the listeners, we are going on a brief holiday break for the next couple of weeks, and we'll be back with the same season in January 2026.
Thank you, Felicia. Thank you so much.
Visit us at cpoplaybook.com. Your support as a subscriber means the world to us, so thank you for tuning in. I'm Felicia Shakiba. Let's connect on LinkedIn.